I'm going to talk about, oh, by the way, I'm Shannon Ferrell with the OSU Department of Agricultural Economics, in case you forgot that from the introduction. And before I get to talking, I also need to give a recognition to our meal sponsor, NextEra Energy Resources, the company that operates the Minco Wind Energy Center, was our meal sponsor today. They paid for our lunch, so we appreciate them doing that. Today, and yes, absolutely. Anybody that's willing to pay for my lunch, I will happily give some applause to. We're going to talk today in this last section of the program about that 40-page document that lands on your kitchen table with that thud, that wind energy lease agreement. Somebody has come to you, they've identified your property as being a good spot for wind energy development. What happens? How do we have the legal relationship between the developer and the landowner that actually enables that project to go into operation and hopefully enables the landowner to get paid a little bit? So we're going to talk about several of those aspects. We're going to talk about things in fairly broad terms. And I would remind you, again, to refer to your notebooks. We've got the draft chapter in there on wind energy leasing. Also, check that web page that I showed you earlier, that agecon.okstate.edu/wind page. And we've put dozens, literally dozens of links up there. So you can read all you want to about the issues that are involved with wind energy leasing. And here in a few weeks, we'll have the videos from today posted as well. We'll have the PowerPoint presentations posted, so you'll be able to review everything at your leisure. All right. Well, my first few slides, the first presenter's pretty much covered, so I'm not going to beat that horse too much. All I want to do is, again, show you that formula. Mike showed you that formula about first thing we got started this morning, the formula for how much power a turbine can derive from the wind. And what I want you to know is that there are two variables there, like Mike said, we could challenge. We could talk about that pi r squared, or we could talk about that V. Pi r squared, that's the area of the rotor disc. How big our blades are impact that. That's why as technology gets better and better, blades get longer and turbines get more efficient. They can operate in a wider range of wind speeds, because the more wind they can capture, the slower wind speed that they will kick in at. See, all turbines have a minimum speed before they'll actually even get turning. And the longer those blades are, the lower that minimum speed is, and the more operational range they have. That V cubed is what's so important for us here in Oklahoma, though. Since that V stands for velocity and it's cubed, which means multiplied to the power of 3, if I have twice the wind speed, if I go from an area with 5 mile per hour winds to an area with 10 mile per hour winds, that's a doubling of wind speed, but that's 8 times, 2 times 2 times 2, 2 cubed, the wind power. So there's a tremendous amount of difference in just a little change in wind power. So what does that mean for developers? The developers look for areas of the state, like we talked about in those maps, where they can find good average wind speeds, but also they try to build those towers as high as they can, because like Kyla was saying, the higher you go up into the air, the higher and smoother the wind speeds tend to be. See, wind gets dragged down by stuff that causes turbulence. And if you look at the ground, there's buildings, there's hills, there's trees. That stuff causes turbulence. The higher you get above that, the smoother the winds become and the faster they become. So that's why turbine towers tend to be so tall. Kyla showed you where all the wind energy projects are in the state, and there are a lot of them, and that number is still growing. Matter of fact, we're going to go to a project today. We're going to see phase 2 of that project in our tour that's completed, but phase 3 is currently under construction. And furthermore, if you go up to Calumet, you can also see a separate wind energy project that's under construction there as well. There's another project under construction just north of Enid. Kyla mentioned the project that's about to be completed there at Guyman. So again, the number of turbines in the state is large and growing. Right now we're about the 8th in the nation in terms of states with wind power capacity. Who knows where we'll be at the end of the year. We've already talked about the wind energy resource maps. These maps are all included in your materials, so go ahead and take a look at them. Also, if you will go online, you can go to the Oklahoma Wind Power Initiative. I would tell you what the website is, but it's too crazy to remember. So just get on Google and look up Oklahoma Wind Power Initiative. And that's one of the links on our site, by the way. And you can get an interactive map where you can zoom in to your property and figure out what the wind resource looks like on your place. Developers are obviously going to look at wind speed. We talked about that. And we'll talk about here in a few moments about the other things they look for in a property that they're going to develop as well. We talked about the Panhandle's wind energy resource for many, many years. If I flip back one slide, you see that there's a tremendous amount of wind out in the Panhandle. But for years and years and years, there was no development out there. And the reason for that was that there just wasn't any transmission capabilities. Power is great, but power is only worth something in the marketplace if you can get it to the marketplace. And that takes large-scale transmission lines. So until we had the prospect of the Clean Line project and other projects being constructed for transmission capacity, there really wasn't a realistic expectation of us getting any power out to market in the Panhandle. So that's why you've actually seen the Guyman project completed now, is because we do have that transmission infrastructure in place. Well, developers are into developing all this wind energy stuff because it's green, it's friendly for the environment, and really that's all they care about, right? Probably not. They probably actually like to make money at this stuff, as do we all. So what does it take to make money in wind? Well, first off, wind. If you're going to have a coal-fired power plant, you better have some means of getting the coal. If you're going to have a natural gas-fired power plant, you better have some means of getting natural gas. If you're going to have a wind energy project, you better have some means of getting to wind. And we've already talked about Oklahoma's wind resource. We don't need to talk about that much more, but that's just one more reason to say developers are going to look very carefully at the wind resource in an area before they do anything there. Matter of fact, most of the people that finance wind energy projects are going to require that the developer have at least 1 year of wind data for their site before they even authorize them to go ahead with construction. That's why you might see a little bitty thing that kind of looks like a small cell tower pop up overnight. That's a meteorological data tower. You might also hear them called a MET tower. That's how the developer measures those wind speeds. And they'll measure that probably over at least a year, if not longer, so that they can show over the course of the year, I actually have a project that's viable. Incentives. Now, Kyla talked a lot about the production tax credit, or the PTC, and that's one of the things that's in a lot of flux right now, and that's definitely true. The production tax credit is a tax credit, and sometimes that term gets confusing. There are deductions and there are credits. Let's say, for example, you and I, when we're filling out our personal income tax, we have a deduction. I spent $1 on something that's deductible. Well, then that means on my taxes, I don't get $1 off my taxes. I get $1 deductible, which reduces what my income looks like. So if I'm taxed at the 25% tax bracket, for that $1 I spent, I get 25 cents off my taxes. So that's a deduction. What we're talking about here is a tax credit. I want you to think of a tax credit like a gift card. They say for every kilowatt hour of power you generate from wind, here's a 2.2 cent gift card. Gosh, thanks. Now, if I accumulate enough of those up over a while, that actually starts to mean real money. And that's a 1-to-1, okay? So for every $1 of credit I get, I take $1 off my taxes. Why is that so important for the wind power industry? Well, for a long time, the industry rule of thumb was kind of that if natural gas prices were where they were historically, that you could break even selling your power, and that the production tax credit would probably be your profit margin. So break even on the sale of power, and that tax credit would provide your profit margin. Now, things have changed since then. Number one, to have a tax credit be worth anything to you, you have to owe taxes. And many of the people that were heavy investors in wind energy projects were investment banks. The big guys like AIG and JP Morgan and those guys, and how they've been doing over the past few years. So deductions may not mean as much to you if you don't have anything to deduct from. So that's been one problem. And the other problem has been that natural gas prices have been low, really, really low, because we've had tremendous production and we've discovered more and more production all over the place. So our gas prices have been relatively low. In Oklahoma especially, we use a lot of natural gas for our power generation. We use more than almost anybody else around us. And so that's had a negative impact on the cost of electricity. Well, I say that. For the consumer, it's been a positive. We've been paying actually a little bit less for our electricity in terms of kilowatt hours because we've had relatively low natural gas prices and we use a lot of natural gas. I'm not saying your electrical bill has been lower because of the summer of 2010 and the summer of 2011 and the summer of 2012. But our prices per kilowatt hour have gone down. So what Kyla was talking about is what the future of the PTC may hold is very true. There's been a lot of political fighting, let's be honest, between renewables and between traditional power like coal, natural gas, oil, things of that sort. And the argument that I always hear from the oil and natural gas lobby is that, well, wind gets all these subsidies and we don't get any subsidies. Not quite. That's not how that works. Wind gets a production tax credit. That's true. And there aren't a lot of tax credits in the oil and gas industry. But the oil and gas industry has a lot of provisions in the tax code that makes that kind of investment very favorable for people as well. So they're really not comparing things apples to apples and oranges to oranges. If you want to talk about the tax structure in wind and you want to talk about the tax structure in oil and gas, it's apples and oranges. So one thing that the wind industry has said is, okay, if you want to get rid of the PTC, get rid of the PTC. Tax us like the other energy industries. And there's a lot of debate. If that's the case, will wind look as profitable as it does now? Don't know. That depends on a lot of things. But that research is going to be fleshed out, I suspect, in the next year or two as that political debate continues. Okay, the market for power is obviously important. And like Kyla was telling you, our market is actually relatively low for power. We pay less per kilowatt hour than any of our neighbors. Any of the states that touch us, they all pay more for their power than we do. So our market actually kind of works against us. But thanks to the transmission projects like we have, like the Plains and Eastern project, we're tapping into other markets where that retail price of power is higher, and that's actually boosting our market here in the state. The costs incurred in capturing and selling power. Now, there are a couple of ways you can look at that. Number one is getting that power to market, transmission costs. And so as we're going to talk about here in a second, if you're a developer, the two biggest things that you care about when you're looking at a location for a project are what's the average wind speed and how close am I to a big transmission line. Those are the two biggest factors because wind power projects have to have high capacity lines to get that power to market. The line we're going to take a look at today is one of the biggest classes. It's a 345 kilovolt line. And that's the size of the line we're talking about. Very expensive to construct. You're looking at perhaps $200,000 a mile to build that. So developers want to be as close as they can to existing transmission lines so they don't have to incur the expense of building line to get there. So that's one element of it. Obviously, they care a lot about the cost of building the project itself, and we'll talk about that on our tour as well. And the other thing that you have to look at is your landowner payments. Because when you think about it, you're not really paying for the fuel, you're paying for access to the fuel. In other words, what do I have to pay a landowner to be on their property, operate my project? So those are some of the big factors that developers look at when they're trying to figure out what their costs are. Financing is obviously a huge part of that as well. And the finance markets have been kind of crazy here lately. They're starting to settle down a little bit, and financing's kind of become a little bit more settled than it was back in the days when the market was really turning over heavily. So like we talked about, when you're a developer, you're trying to balance, do I go to an area of the state where I've got a lot of wind, but I don't have much transmission, or do I go to a part of the state where I don't have as much wind resource, but I'm a lot closer to transmission lines? Our state is a classic example of this. If I were to flip back a few slides and show you that map of wind power projects and you looked at it compared to the wind resource, you'd see that there are several projects that are in the really, really, really high wind resource areas. But why are they there and not in the other high resource areas? It's because those resource areas around Woodward, around Elk City, around Weatherford, around Lawton, they were all Oh, coincidentally, really close to big transmission lines. So high resource, close to transmission, no brainer. Build it there. But what we've seen in projects being built this year in 2011 and 2012 are projects around Enid and El Reno and Minco. If you look at that wind resource map, the wind's not as fantastic, but they're a lot closer to transmission lines and a lot closer to major population centers. That's where electricity gets purchased. So that's what developers are looking at here. If they've got higher wind resources, that means that they have higher project revenues, but the question is, do they have higher expenses in building in that area? The flip side is, if I have to build more transmission, that increases my project costs. If I'm in a lower wind resource area, that may mean my revenues go down. So it's this constant balancing act that developers are trying to maintain of how do I balance revenues and costs. That's why wind resource and transmission line proximity are the two biggest factors I can tell landowners to look at if you're trying to figure out whether your land is ripe for development. Well, let's talk about these leases then. And when you look at a wind energy lease, what are you really trying to do? You're trying to harmonize two people using the same piece of property at the same time for very different stuff. For years and years and years, we've been doing this in the oil and gas industry. But the only problem is, in the oil and gas industry, you dig a hole and no one ever really sees what else happens there, except around the location. So you really don't notice that. Here in the wind energy industry, everything's above the ground, so you see it a lot more readily. So what we're trying to do is harmonize the developer's use of the property with the landowners. Now, in the oil and gas industry, we've been doing this for over a century. And by no means am I saying we've nailed it, okay? There's still room for improvement, trust me. But we at least have a century of experience behind us, and so a lot of things are already known, they're industry custom, they're implied into that lease. So there's so much other law surrounding that issue that I can give you a 2-page oil and gas lease, and it contains basically everything that we need to have. Not so in the wind energy industry. We don't have any of that. Everything that we do has to be laid out explicitly, and that's why those things are so honking long. Everything has to be laid out in written detail because we don't have any of the industry custom, we don't have any of the background, so we're creating it all ourselves. That's one reason those things are so long. Another reason is, not only are you entering a contract with the wind energy company, you're entering it with the utility that they're selling power to, they're entering into a contract with their banker, their insurance company, blah, 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 blah. And by the time everybody's lawyer has a swipes at it, it gets long. Trust me, I'm a lawyer. I'm incapable of writing anything short. Ask anybody I work with. All right. Well, what all are we going to do then in this agreement? Well, the short version of the story is that the agreement needs to provide that the developer can come onto the property, build and operate the project, and transmit power off site. Now, if you left the contract up to the engineers, the contract would be about a page long because they just say that. But there's lots of other stuff involved, and so that's why the contract has to be much longer. One of the reasons that wind energy agreements are tough to understand is because they're trying to do a lot of things at once. I call them wind energy agreements because they're a lease, but they're also an easement, and they're also a contract. So I can't really say that they're one or the other, they're all of them. And one of the things that you see in there is that there are several different kinds of easements that they're going to ask for, and we'll talk about them each in relatively quick succession here. But they're going to talk about easements for getting onto the property, easements for actually building the project, for building transmission and getting the power off site, a negative easement that says you won't do anything to block the wind. We'll think about that here in a second. Overhang, meaning that it's okay if someone else's turbine is over your property as long as your turbine can go over their property. And noise. Well, when we talk about access easements, there's probably actually going to be several different kinds of access easements in your agreement. The first one that you're likely to see is that they have the ability to build roads on the project property. Now, that's one thing that you want to talk to them about if you're a landowner, is say, okay, let's talk about these access roads. Where can I position them so that they cause the minimum disruption to the property use while you guys still have the roads that you need. Sometimes that's a diagonal, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's a straight line, sometimes it's an angle. So we've got the easements for access roads, but you may also see that they want access for assessing the property, doing wildlife studies, doing data acquisition for the wind, things like that sort, doing soil tests. Why soil tests? They don't grow these things. I mean, I know it's called a wind farm, but they don't grow the turbines, right? No, but they are massively, massively heavy under a lot of mechanical stresses. And so they need to see if those soils can actually support the structures that they're building there. You may also see a Met Tower easement or a Met Tower agreement. Those are those little towers I was telling you about. They look like little cell phone towers that go up pretty quickly. Those are what they use to measure the wind speed and other parameters around the project. So you may see that, but I'm willing to bet in your easements you also see what we call a blanket easement. And that blanket easement says we have the right to go anywhere on the property for purposes necessary for the project. Or sometimes they may not say necessary. They just may say we can go anywhere on your property. I'm kind of a fan of saying, all right, well, let's make sure that it's a reason that's reasonably necessary for you. Not just anything you want to do, but if you can show me that it's directly linked to you operating the project, okay, then we'll talk about that. Sometimes they might want to do wildlife population surveys that happen to involve deer in hunting season, so you may want to charge them for that. We'll probably want to let them do some deer harvesting. But yeah, because turbines can impact deer, and we just need to know how many deer there are, especially that big one over there with the nice rack. Okay, so be cautious about that. Construction easements. Construction easements are different from access easements. The access easements may be permanent easements, except for the blanket. The blanket they may allow to go away, but check your lease on that. But with the construction easement says that the actual construction of the project is going to take up more space and it's going to be more disruptive than the other phases of the project. And so the reason for that construction easement is to make sure they have permission to do those things. What you need to do is make sure that you're compensated for the additional impact that that development has. And if you want to see some examples of that, the Minko Phase 3 is currently under construction. If you go down to Highway 152, there where it intersects with Highway 81, take Highway 152 west until 37 splits off of it, and start taking 37 when it kind of starts to wiggle worm its way north and west, you can see some of the construction on Minko Phase 3 there. And you can just kind of see for yourself, how does the land look when it's under construction? Another example of construction is what's going on up at Calumet right now with the, I believe it's the Chisholm Trail project. I think they call that. It's being developed by Apex. Go to Calumet, head north on Calumet. I apologize, I can't recall which highway goes north off of 40 there. Which one? 270. 270, the one that goes straight north? Okay. Take 270 straight north till you go to Calumet. Then you know 270 starts to go off to the northwest. Don't do that. Keep going straight on Calumet Road. If you keep going straight on Calumet Road, you'll start to drive through the construction of the Apex project. And the Apex project kind of goes east and west there, as most of our projects do. I know it's along Edmond Road and a couple of other of those section line roads. And don't trespass. Stay on the public roads. But stay on the public roads and you can see some of the elements of construction there right now. I can describe what construction looks like to you, but the best way to do it is just to go take a look at it. I'm kind of jealous. We actually got to do a construction tour when we were doing the Enid workshop. I wasn't able to arrange one for you guys, so I apologize about that. When we're talking about construction, you've got road issues, obviously, but another thing the construction easement's probably going to talk about is laydown areas. You're probably familiar with laydown areas from the oil and gas industry, but those are areas where they're basically staging the equipment until it's actually assembled. And I'll show you a few slides real quickly as we get ready for our tour of kind of what some of the construction looks like. When we talk about the transmission easement, there are two things that you need to understand about transmission of power from these facilities. You're probably going to have two kinds of lines, overhead and underground. Most of the turbines almost always are going to be connected via underground lines. Nice, big, thick copper lines that are buried under the ground that connect the turbines together. And then once they're connected together, they'll then go to a substation where the voltage will be increased and the power will be sent off to market. Most of us aren't terribly familiar with underground transmission lines because really the only other place you typically see those are in towns where they want to get them out of sight. Typically it's in the rich people neighborhoods where they'll pay to bury those things. Well, here you have to understand that one thing you need to make sure that's required in your agreement is that those things are under plow depth. Because let me tell you, if you snag a 10,000 volt line with your moldboard plow, it will ruin your whole day, okay? Now, many leases contain provisions that say, okay, yeah, we'll keep those things under plow depth, but what you need to make sure you do in your agreement is to say, let's make sure that it stays below plow depth. And when I talk to people about that, they kind of look at me weird, like, well, what happens? Does stuff underground ever find its way to the surface? Yeah. Through cultivation, through erosion, that can happen. So make sure that those lines are always below plow depth, and that if any erosion takes place, that they'll provide soil fill in again to make sure that those things are at the proper depth. Now, we'll also have overhead lines at our property, or we may. It depends on where you're at in relation to the project. If all you have are turbines on your place, you may not have any overhead lines. Overhead lines, by and large, are going to be coming out from the project substation and going on to connect to a major transmission line somewhere nearby. So you may or may not have overhead lines on your place. It just depends. Now, what I will also tell you, though, is that if you look at almost any lease, the lease is going to have a blanket permission for transmission lines. Basically to say, if we don't have turbines on your place, it's still okay for us to put overhead transmission lines on the property. You want to do that? That's up to you. You need to make sure that you understand that that's included in your lease. Most leases do include that. And you also need to understand that sometimes that transmission easement power can be given by the developer to somebody else if someone else approaches them about building those transmission lines. So make sure that you understand that, and if you're comfortable with that negotiation. Non-obstruction easements say that you will not block the wind. People look at me like I'm crazy when I talk about this one too. Because they say, hey, Ferrell, if we knew how to block the wind in Oklahoma, don't you think we would have done that by now? Well, haven't we? How do we block the wind in Oklahoma? We've been doing it since the Dust Bowl. Trees, exactly, shelter belts. So what some wind energy agreements will say is that you're not going to do anything that obstructs the wind. Now, that's pretty extreme because technically anything you do obstructs the wind. So some agreements will temper that and say, okay, well, you can do anything as long as it's under 40 feet and it's so many hundred feet from the project. Some will say, do whatever you want just as long as you ask us first. We won't deny it as long as we can show that it won't materially, that's a lawyer word, meaning significantly, impact how the turbines operate. And most of the stuff that we do isn't. Unless we're building like a really tall grain tower, feed tower, something like that, we're probably going to be okay. But just make sure you understand what you have to do to get approval to build anything on your project, or I'm sorry, on your property if the project actually does get built. Now, I've seen it go from one extreme to the other. One extreme says, yeah, we don't care. If it's under 40 feet, go for it. All the way to, if you want to build anything on our property, our property, you have to ask us first and get permission. So understand what your agreement says about that and what level of permission you're comfortable with there. The overhang and encroachment easement says basically that it's okay if turbines overhang property lines. The only way this is ever going to work really is if both landowners have signed that easement. So usually that's going to be one of the requirements of the agreement. It's usually not that big of a deal, but the reason that they have to do this is that technically if I'm standing on my side of the property and I stick my hand over your property line, I am technically trespassing. Maybe it annoys you, maybe it doesn't, I don't know. It sure annoyed my brother when we were on long car trips and I was in his space in the back car, in the seat, and like, oh, I'm in your space, I'm in your space. Okay, I did not have an easement with him, and he let the court and dad hear about it. So, that's why we have the overhang and encroachment easements there. The noise easement, and this is one thing I'm looking forward to on the tour, is to let you see exactly how loud a turbine is. Because so much has been made about the noise generated by turbines. I want you guys to actually be able to go out and hear what a turbine sounds like. We actually have some wind today, so you'll actually be able to hear that. Now, I'm going to do something very rare for a lawyer. I'm going to shut up for 5 seconds. Y'all hear that? That's about 40 decibels. You hear the hum of the lights and some of the HVAC going on? That's about 40 decibels. A wind turbine at 10 miles per hour, 1,000 feet away, is about 45 to 55 decibels. That's hard to quantify for us because decimals are a different scale. Decibels are what they call a logarithmic scale, and you're like, I got out of high school math, please don't bug me with logarithms. What I mean is this. Decibels are a log 10 scale. That means that a sound that is 10 decibels louder, 45 to 55, is 10 times louder. Okay? So it's a difference. It's like this, not like that. So I just want you guys to go out. I've actually talked to the bus driver. We get off the bus, he'll actually turn the bus off, and you can just listen and hear what a turbine sounds like. Some people have said it sounds like the swooshing of the wind. Some people say they sound like B-1B bombers. Have any of you guys ever heard a B-1B bomber? I'm not going to say I'm for or against wind turbines, but I'm going to say I don't think they sound like B-1B bombers. Because my farm back in western Oklahoma used to be part of a training pattern. I know what a B-1B bomber sounds like, and it doesn't sound like a turbine. So I'm going to let you guys make that judgment for yourself there. You do need to understand that turbines do make noise, though. And it's not a noise that's exactly like the wind. It's a little bit different. Because the wind kind of gently goes up and down, and your brain kind of tunes constant sounds out. Heck, that's why I sleep with a fan, even when it's 32 degrees outside. Because that nice constant sound drowns out all the loud exhaust that the college kids have in my neighborhood. But sounds that vary are more noticeable. Why do sirens go ear, ear, ear instead of eep? Because you tune them out if they went eep. But if they vary, you pay more attention to them. Well, turbines make variable noise. As each blade goes by, you hear the sound generated by that specific blade, so it's different. Now, there's a lot of research going on right now about how that kind of sound specifically impacts people. Nothing's really conclusive yet, so I can't really tell you that there's any research information on it. Just understand turbines make noise. How do you fix the noise that turbines make? Move away from them. That sounds like a really duh solution there, Professor Ferrell, but what most people do in their leases is they have a setback requirement. They require that the turbine be X number of feet away from any occupied house. Sometimes that may be 1,000 feet. Lots of the sound effects, if you look at a graph of how the sound impacts affect a turbine's area, it's really high close to the turbine, and then it drops off really sharply as you get out to about 1,000 feet. It doesn't go away completely, but it drops off fairly sharply. Some people say 1,000 feet, some people say 1,500 feet. What I'll tell you to do is find a range that you feel is comfortable, but also understand if you want a turbine on your property, you may have to consider what those setback distances do. If you're only on 160 acres and you have a 1,500 foot setback radius and your house is in the middle of your quarter, where can you put turbines? It starts to get pretty dicey, doesn't it? So be careful about that. That can kind of backfire if you want to have a turbine on your place, but you also don't want to have to worry about the sound impacts there. I usually do this in the course of a 3-hour presentation. I'm not going to do that to you today. Don't worry. I saw a few worried glances flash across people's faces. I'm not going to do that to you. I've boiled it down. I'm going to tell you that whenever you get an oil and gas, guess which presentation I did last? Whenever you get a wind energy agreement, there are 5 questions that you need to ask. Here we go. Number 1, how's your current use of the property going to be affected by the project? Number 2, how long is the agreement going to last? Number 3, Number 3, what are you required to do under the agreement? Number 4, how are you going to get paid? And number 5, what happens when the project is over? So let's talk about these real quick. How's your property going to be affected by the project? This is why when Rusty and I were filling out the application for the grant that funded this project, we wanted to make sure that tours were a part of the project, because so many people talk about how their land has been impacted by a turbine, but how many people have ever actually seen how it works? We all watch them from I-40 or from somewhere nearby, but how often have you gotten really close to them? So that's what we want to do. We want you to actually see how these turbines can impact land development. This picture here is a 160 acre quarter section near one of the Woodward wind energy projects, and you can see the turbines, right there. Actually, you can see the shadows better than you can see the turbines. The Wind Energy Association, the industry group, estimates that for every megawatt of capacity, you have to have 60 acres of open space. Now, many people look at that statistic and go, whoa, you're going to take up 60 acres of my property with every one of these turbines? No, that's not what they mean. What they mean is you need 60 acres of open space so that there's nothing interfering with the wind flow to the turbine. Now, of that 60 acres, per megawatt by the way, only about 3 acres are actually occupied. When we talk about occupied, we mean the access roads, the transmission easements, the substations, the turbine pads, those things. Land that we're going to lose out of production. Kyla was telling you about that cattle raiser that was worried about how much lower his stocking rate was going to be if they had the wind energy project, and you heard it was really fairly marginal. So really, much of the land is still open to agricultural use. It just has to be kept free of those obstructions that we talked about for the wind. So the rest of that is just open space, the remaining 97%. So that's what we talk about. We're saying we're probably looking at 3 acres per megawatt of land that's actually being occupied there. When you're talking about putting these things in a field, and it's a little bit different impact than if we're putting them in pasture land, because obviously they can still have an impact on pasture land. In pasture land, we have to worry about changes in our erosion patterns, where the access roads go. Are we going to still have access to our fencing patterns and grazing patterns? What about gates and things like that? When we're talking about them in fields, you have to worry about some of the cultivation impacts. And there we're primarily talking about obstruction issues. If I put an object in a field where I've got row crops, now I have to have another turn row, or I may lose some productive area. If I'm talking about access roads, I either probably want to have my access roads right next to the fence line, or I need to have them far enough away from the fence line that I can actually get a full-size implement through there without having to eat fence or eat road up. Those are some things that we just need to think about. Another issue there, if I included the slide, irrigation. If you've got any land under center pivot, obviously putting a turbine in an area with the pivot is going to make you lose part of your coverage there. So you have to think about that. And it may be worth talking to the developer to say, hey, is there a way that we could put the turbine in the corner? Not using the corner for anything anyway. Go nuts over there. But it's hard to build a pivot that goes around a turbine, and it's hard to build a turbine that goes around the pivot. So consider those issues there. This is a picture from the Chisholm View project north of Enid towards Hunter and Salt Fork. And this is taken in the summer. This was taken in July, and you remember what the weather was like in July. So things don't look super lush and green up there. But this is during the construction phase, and you can see we've got the access road being built out to the turbine, so that's going to take up more space now than it will in operation, because lots of that is going to come in. The turbine pad area is much bigger during construction than it will be in operation because they have to have room to maneuver around there. That may also get shrank as we go into the production phase as well. When you're talking about dealing with the construction phase and handling those sorts of issues, there are a number of factors that you have to consider. We already talked about grow and shrink of the construction area, that the construction area may be larger than the actual operational area, and that's something that needs to be covered in your agreement. What is going to be the actual area of the project when it's done? How close can I farm next to the turbine pad? How close can I farm next to the access road? Decompaction is another issue. A lot of heavy stuff is involved in these projects. I mean, there ain't nothing light about a wind turbine. The lightest piece of a turbine is the blades. Each blade's about 10 tons. That's the light stuff. Everything else is a lot heavier. So when you've got all that stuff being trucked into your area, you may need to go through and decompact those soils. Maybe do some deep ripping to make sure that you've reduced that soil compaction to a level where you can still cultivate crops and forages. Restoring topsoil. Double trenching is huge. You're going to have a lot of trenching operations to lay in that connecting cable. So make sure topsoil goes over here, subsoil goes over there. And when we put it back in, subsoil goes in first, topsoil goes on top. Lots of people I've observed do double trenching, but they don't observe the double trenching principle when they put it back in. They just shove it in. So make sure your agreement provides that you do that double trenching to make sure that your topsoil actually does stay on top. Make sure you have provisions that say all of your conservation structures, things like dams, terraces, contours, things of that sort are preserved, or if they're not preserved, that they're repaired in a fashion that doesn't unnecessarily change the drainage or erosion patterns on your property. Odds are you've probably spent a lot of time getting your conservation structures in the shape that they need to be, and you need to keep them that way. And managing erosion can be a problem. Well, I say that. In years where we get rain, managing erosion can be a problem. Most of the projects this year, no sweat, not a problem, no erosion to be had. But make sure that you do take care of that, because it may actually rain in Oklahoma again sometime, and we need to make sure that our erosion structures are taken care of as well, and that we don't lose topsoil or violate our CRP agreements or anything like that. Restoring vegetation obviously matters as well, and we were talking at the lunch break about what that means. When you're talking about sandy soils and how long it takes to establish cover, it may mean sod. Seeding may not be enough. We need to talk about restoring the plant community to something that's at least approximate to what the plant community was before we came in and disrupted all this stuff. Like I do any project development. I'm a professor. I just develop students. I don't develop projects. Oh, irrigation. I already talked about that. Moving on. Click, 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 click. Sorry, there's a lot of clicks involved in the irrigation thing apparently. There we go. Okay. Rusty talked about some of the tort damages that you've got when you're dealing with wind energy projects, some of the nuisance and property damages and things of that sort. When I'm talking about it from the contracting perspective, I'm a big fan of what they call liquidated damages. In other words, if you hit my cow, we're not going to argue over what the cow's worth. We're going to have a provision in our contract that says what that cow's worth. You hit cow, you write check. Pretty straightforward. Now, how you determine that is kind of up to you. Some people just have a set amount. You hit one cow equals X number of dollars. Now, that's kind of tough to do because we all know that cattle prices stay perfectly flat over time, right? No, maybe they do that. So another way you can do it is you can set that amount to some number that both you and the developer can go look up and objectively determine. So that may be that we go to the USDA market report for OKC West and say, okay, you hit this cow on October 6th. So we'll go to the next week's sale. What was that cow going to bring at OKC West? Okay, that's what we pay. You can do the same thing for crops. You may say for every acre of property of growing crop damaged, we're going to agree to pay this amount, and that amount may be based on your historical average yields if you have them. And if you don't have historic average yields, shame on you. Keep better farm records. I'm going to send Dr. Damona Doy down here to chew you guys out about that. If not, okay, fine. We're going to go to the NRCS or FSA records for the county and use that as our average, and then multiply that by maybe the nearby futures contract price or something like that. Whatever it is, just make sure that you can both figure out what that number is and you don't have to argue about it. That way you say, okay, this damage was done. Here's the amount of damage. Here's the calculation. There we go. Does the agreement handle blocking crop production? What if I can't get in to sow my wheat? What if I can't get in to graze my pasture because you guys happen to be in the construction phase? How's that going to be compensated? Do you have to pay me the rental rate for comparable ground? Is that a specific dollar amount? I'm not saying there's a right or wrong answer. The right answer is what you can live with. That's the right answer. What tools can you use? We've talked about schedules. We've talked about liquidated damage calculations, things of that sort. And an attorney can help you out with that fairly easily because they should be familiar with that. When we say that you have to use the property and keep it free of obstructions, that doesn't mean you can't do anything else with it. As we're going to go out there and see today, you're going to see wheat sown right up to that road and right up to that turbine pad. So you can use most of the property for crop production. It's not going to be the same as it was. You've got obviously more disruptions in your field, and you've lost some of that acreage, so you have to consider that. But by and large, you can still use it. Most livestock don't seem to mind it too much. We've been looking for research that talks about any of the impacts that wind energy development have had on livestock production, and we haven't found anything yet. So all we have is basically stories, anecdotes from producers. And producers say cows don't seem to mind them too much. This picture was taken down at the Blue Canyon project. And in the daytime down there when it gets really hot, they'll hug the turbine because that turbine kind of conducts the cool of the earth up. And then as the day goes on, that's the only shade they've got. So as that tower shadow goes out through the day, you have a cow sundial where they line up in the shade and just kind of track it as the day goes on. So cows and shadow flicker appear to be okay. They're fine with it, but humans may have a different angle on it. Terrestrial wildlife doesn't seem to mind it too awful much. I will talk really quickly about the prairie chicken issue. Sources tell me that it's highly likely that the Fish and Wildlife Service is probably going to propose listing the prairie chicken as endangered, but that's not the same as listing it. When they propose it, what they're saying is, hey, we think we're going to do this, now we're going to ask the public for comment. So they can change their mind, but they say that it looks like they're going to at least propose listing it. Prairie chickens don't like tall things. Something that's 8 foot tall is a tall thing to a prairie chicken. Why do prairie chickens not like tall things? Because their predator is the red-tailed hawk, or the chicken hawk. So they know that my enemy hangs out on top of tall things, that's why I don't like tall things. Well, prairie chickens look at a turbine and go, wow, that's a really tall thing. So I'll back off. But curiously, in some wind energy projects, they found that prairie chickens come closer to the turbines. And they're like, well, why is that? Well, what the prairie chickens have figured out is that hawks hate turbines. Hawks soar. They need smooth wind to do that. Wind power projects generate a lot of turbulence at altitude. So the hawks... So the prairie chicken goes, well, the guys that eat me don't like these, so suddenly I like them. Okay? So who knows how it's all going to shake out, but obviously the Endangered Species Act issues are real, and that's something that not just wind, oil and gas, agriculture, everybody needs to be concerned about. How long is the agreement going to last? Rusty gave the perfect example. If, when they were signing the treaty at Appomattox, if the good general had just went on sign and said, oh, hey, here's a wind energy lease, okay, I'll sign that too. That 150-year wind energy lease would still be in effect today for some historical perspective. Now, I haven't seen many leases that long lately. Most of them now are in the 50-year range. But the reason that developers want their lease to last so long is because, hey, that's the resource. I know the resource is there, so I want to be on top of it as long as the resource is around. When you guys sign your oil and gas leases, how long do your oil and gas lease last? 2 or 3 years, or so long as oil and gas are produced in paying quantities from the property, right? That's what the wind energy guys were trying to do. Except there was only one problem. The wind could be there forever. So that's why they were shooting for 150 years, is because they thought that's as long as they could get away with. Now, most of them have shrunk back from that because of the huge backlash they got as a result of it. So like I said, now most leases last 50 years, but what you need to understand is that they may not say 50 years. They may say a 30-year initial term plus 2 10-year developer-only options. 30 plus 10 plus 10 equals 20. Okay, so now it equals 50. So you need to read those length clauses very carefully and understand, okay, who has the option to renew? Do I? Do they? Almost always it's them, and many times it's only them. Are you comfortable with that? Do you want to say, hey, is renewal automatic, or do I get some sort of notification about this? Are we going to get to renegotiate any of the terms when these renewal periods come up? Maybe the electrical market looks a lot different. Maybe electricity's way more expensive. Or maybe somebody found some way to make free electricity from garbage. All right, well, now power's pretty cheap. So who knows? But ask yourself, are those opportunities going to be there? Do you want those opportunities to be there? Maybe if you're comfortable with the terms you have now, you're like, fine, let's stick with it. Just understand, number one, this agreement's going to last for a while. Number two, for many of us, this can be an intergenerational issue. I'm 36 years old. If I sign a 50-year lease, I could be signing an estate planning issue. Okay? I hope I live past 86, but I don't know. I look at my family medical history. We've got every malady known to mankind. So maybe it's something that my heirs or my kids or my great-grandkids have to think about as well. Understand that. What are your obligations under the agreement? With an oil and gas lease, your obligations are usually stay out of the way, let us pump oil. Okay, got it. But if a wind energy agreement is in place, you probably have lots of affirmative jobs you have to do to fulfill your obligations under that agreement. One is obviously the non-obstruction stuff. We've talked about that. But you may also have indemnification problems. Indemnity means if somebody does damage to the project equipment, who pays for it? If it's you or your employees or your guests, odds are the agreement says you pay for it. And that's probably fair, but some agreements say if it's anybody who's not us, meaning the developer, it must be you. Not sure how I feel about that. I'm happy to cover the people that I brought there, but what if it's a trespasser? Okay? Who knows? That's one reason, by the way, that any wind energy agreement really needs to have a provision for anyone who's a lease hunter on the property. If you have any lease hunters on your property, you need to make sure that they sign an agreement and that the developer agrees to it as well that says, if you do any damage to the project property, you pay for it, not us. It's Oklahoma. Go look at any road sign and how many times it's been used for target practice. We Oklahomans really like to shoot at stuff on poles. Okay? And turbines are very large objects on poles. And I know that somebody's been out there going, I know them blades are spinning awful fast, but I bet I can do it. So be very careful about that. Please don't shoot the transformers. Please don't shoot the turbines, things like that. Are you going to have any increase in your insurance premiums? Your standard policy may not include turbine riders. Okay? If you've got a large new piece of capital equipment on your property, is your insurer going to be okay with you having an indemnity agreement that says you're going to cover that? I don't know. Steve, does the standard AFR policy have a wind turbine provision in there? I'm guessing not. Not yet. No, they haven't written that in there yet. Okay, so Steve's going to talk to the AFR guys and see if they can beat the Farm Bureau guys on your turbine premiums. Under the Oklahoma Wind Energy Development Act, the developer is required to have insurance on the turbines and have general liability insurance to cover you if there is an incident or damage done to your property. They have to do that. They have to have a certificate of insurance, and they have to include you as a named insured on that policy. So the developers may not know about this requirement, so educate them. Let them know that it's out there, that they are required to have that insurance in place, and that they have to include you on that insurance. We asked the question earlier today, what about CRP and other types of agreements? The CRP regulations were amended back in 2008 to say that if you're going to have a renewable energy project on your property, such as a wind project, if you go talk to USDA in advance, they can do a couple of things. They can just give you an outright exemption that says, yep, it's fine. We're not going to get you out of CRP. Just keep on doing what you're doing. It's fine to develop the project. Or what they can do is they can cut out the portion of your property that's impacted by the project and leave the rest in CRP. So in this case, it is definitely better to ask permission than forgiveness. Because if you handle it proactively, like Kyla said, you can resolve almost all the CRP issues up front. If you don't, then you run the risk of incurring CRP penalties and having to pay back payments, or if you've done it intentionally, yay, the criminal penalties of violating your CRP contract. So be cautious about that. Other things that are out there, property taxes, like Kyla mentioned as well, all of these pieces of equipment are going to be taxed to the developer. The question is is the county assessor going to look at your land any differently? Will they value it up, value it down, or leave it the same if there's a wind energy project? At this point in time, we don't have enough data from enough counties to really be able to tell you that. Nothing's really definitive. What you would be wise to do, though, is in your agreement say, hey, if there is an increase in the tax assessments to my property as a result of the project being here, you'll cover the increase. There are a few isolated incidents in Texas where property taxes went up because of a project being on the property, and the project property tax increases were more than the landowner payments. You do not want to get caught in that situation, okay? I haven't heard of that being an issue in Oklahoma yet, but it is something that's out there that needs to be thought about. One question we get a lot is about oil and gas and wind working together. And I just had to pull this up there. This is the cast of Dallas. And I remember when I was a little kid watching Dallas, Bobby was all into wind and solar. He wanted to diversify Ewing oil away from that oil stuff and kind of get into some different things. Well, now his kid is investing in, methane hydrates and other sorts of energy, so it's the same story just over again. Can oil and wind get together? Absolutely. They absolutely can, but I have a hard time convincing wind people of that, and I have a hard time convincing oil and gas people of that. I'm like, seriously, guys, really, you can play nice together. It's going to be okay. Because wind energy projects are generally fairly dispersed. Like we were talking about, they're spaced fairly wide apart. Plenty of room to get a derrick in between there. It's not a problem. So what you see, though, many times in wind energy agreements is language that says, hey, landowner, you agree you're going to keep the oil and gas company off our back, and you're not going to allow anyone to develop oil and gas if it would disrupt our wind energy project. Well, that's swell if you own the surface and the minerals. You have that level of control. But if you're a surface owner and you don't own the minerals, there's nothing you can do about it. Because Oklahoma law is very clear that the mineral interest owner has the right to enter the property to explore for and produce oil and natural gas. I could cite cases all day long that say that. So what do? Well, you need to make sure that you're not put in the position of being the mediator between the mineral interest owner and the wind energy company. You can tell the wind energy company, I will happily not obstruct your wind project, but I cannot speak for the mineral interest owner because I'm not them. You need to go talk to them about it. The other thing you have to consider is there is a new law in Oklahoma, it's called the Exploration Rights Act of 2011, that says mineral owners have the right to develop the surface for oil and natural gas, that if there's a wind energy project being developed on the property, they have to provide notice to the mineral interest owners that they're about to do that, and they also have to give notice in the local newspapers so that there's not any problems with the development of the oil and gas and the wind. And it really isn't a problem. It can be done. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. It can be done. It just takes a little bit of foresight on the part of the parties. Okay. Many wind energy agreements will contain what we call, time out. Question.
If a person doesn't own the mineral rights to the property, they put a wind farm or tower on their property, does the rights go to the mineral owner or to the surface owner?
The question was, if someone owns the surface but not the minerals, and a turbine is built on the property, does the turbine belong to the mineral owner or to the surface owner? Excellent question, and the answer is to the surface owner. There was another piece of legislation passed, I believe, in 2010 that says that the wind rights are essentially a part of the surface, so that they are tied to the surface and that the wind rights cannot be severed from the surface. So wind rights belong to the surface owner, not to the mineral interest owner. That's a very good question. I'm glad you asked that one. Okay, we were talking about subordination agreements. Subordination agreements are an agreement that says you're going to talk to the people that have an interest in this property other than you. So classic example of that is someone who has a lien on your property, somebody who has a mortgage on your property. You're going to talk to them and tell them, hey, I need you to sign this agreement that says you're not going to foreclose on this landowner if the effect of that foreclosure would be to kick us off. If you foreclose and don't kick us off, hey, that's fine. But just don't foreclose and kick us off. That puts the landowner in a very awkward position. because you have to go to your banker, which you may have had a relationship with for years, and say, hey, by the way, I know you have the first mortgage on my place, but would you mind signing this that says you're not going to foreclose on me? And they may not be too keen on that. So I'm more of a fan of saying, if I'm the landowner, I'm not going to do anything to get in the way of you, developer, trying to get one of those. I'll cooperate with it, but I'm not going to be the one primarily responsible for it, because that's just really not fair. Okay, and that'll probably get us through this one right here. Okay, payments, which I'm sure you guys are probably somewhat thinking about. There are lots of different revenue streams that can come from a wind energy lease. But the problem with that is that there are a lot of different streams that can come from a wind energy lease. You got to keep all of them straight, know how to calculate them objectively. So there may be several easement payments. If it's a permanent easement, you're probably going to get just a one-time upfront payment for that. But if it's a temporary easement, odds are you're going to get periodic payments for that. Make sure you understand what those denominations are and understand how you're going to be paid. Is it going to be paid on an annual basis? Is it a one-time upfront? How's all that going to work? What units are you going to use? Rods, chains, furlongs, leagues, feet, meters, acres. I don't know. It's kind of crazy. And this is one area where I would say there's not a whole lot of analogies between the oil and gas industry and wind that really work. But when you're talking about underground easements, like for transmission lines, those are going to be very different from pipeline easements, okay? So make those adjustments. A road is probably a road. So if you know that people in the area are getting a certain amount for roads, okay, you can probably use that as a pretty good barometer for what you should be getting for a road. But an underground transmission line is probably going to be a much smaller easement with fewer risks, really, than a pipeline easement is going to be. So you may have to adjust that pipeline number down a bit. So just understand that there are those differences and that you're not always comparing apples to apples there. When you're talking about lease payments, most payments these days are going to be a royalty basis. But you may also get a per turbine installation payment, like a one-time upfront payment, kind of like a damages payment. Understand if that's going to be per turbine or per megawatt. If it's per turbine, then 1 turbine, 2 turbine, 3 turbine equals 1 payment, 2 payments, 3 payments. If it's per megawatt, it's 2.3 megawatts plus 2.3 megawatts plus 2.3 megawatts. That's different. Understand those denominations. When you're talking about a royalty, the most important thing I can tell you is understand the definitions, because that royalty is almost always going to be based on what's the amount of power being generated, what's the revenue we're deriving from it, and what deductions can we make from that revenue. So understand everything you include there. We're talking about gross revenue. We want as much stuff to go into gross revenue as we can. So power sales, renewable energy credits or green tags or RECs, all three of those are the same thing. You want those credits to go in there. Tax credits probably can't be. Just the nature of the tax credits make that very difficult to pull off. But you want as many things put into the definition of revenues as you can. You want as many things excluded from deductions as you can pull off. Now, some deductions they basically have to leave in there, things like transmission losses and things like that, because they're probably a function of the lease the power purchase agreement that they have with their utility buyer. But understand what those definitions are. I've seen some leases that made your royalty a function of net profit. What's the definition of net profit? Great question. Ask an accountant, because you can make something that makes tons of money look not profitable if you do it right. So I'm not a big fan of using profit. I am a fan of using revenues because that's an objectively determinable number. Okay, we can figure that out. This is back of the envelope stuff. Do not take these as gospel. I want you to talk to your developer and get the actual data that they have to support their calculations and make sure they're being realistic. Oddly enough, developers can be quite optimistic when they're telling you how much money you're going to get paid from a project, and somewhat more realistic when they're reporting it to IRS. So make sure we're talking about the right numbers here. Let's say we've got a 2 megawatt capacity turbine. Okay? Let's say it has a capacity factor of 35%. That means, on average, day and night, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, it churns out about 35% of its capacity. Conservative for Oklahoma. Most of ours run at about 40, maybe a little bit higher. Let's say the price of power that they're selling is 3 cents a kilowatt hour, and that our royalty is 4%. 4% is a fairly typical starting royalty for most leases. Many of them bump up over time. How much power are we going to get out of this turbine this year? Take our 2 megawatts, that's our capacity, multiply it by how many hours are in a year, 8,760 for those of you keeping track at home. 35% capacity factor means we're going to get about 6.1 million kilowatt hours out of that turbine. It's a lot of juice. All right, how much revenue are they getting from the sale of that power? Well, take those kilowatt hours, multiply it by the price per kilowatt hour. That tells us we're getting about $184,000 in gross revenues from that tower. Our royalty is 4% of that. So multiply that number by 4%, and that tells us that that's about $7,400 per year in royalties from that turbine. This is just a for instance. Don't go home and say, by gosh, I better be getting $7,400 out of my turbine. It could be less. It could be more. It's very site specific. I just want you to be able to do the math and to understand when they present you with figures, can I verify those? Can I actually see if that's actually going to work? For example, if they're telling you that your capacity factor is going to be 50%, they better have a pretty good turbine, or you better have pretty good wind, or that's not quite above board. If it's 20%, well, that's not great either, okay? So kind of have some ballpark for that. Okay. The Wind Energy Development Act says that you have to get statements, that verify your payments. You have to get a statement with your check that shows how they calculated what your payment was, and you have to be able to audit their records as well. They have to make those records available in the state of Oklahoma for you. They can't make you go to Houston or New York to find them. They have to make them available to you in Oklahoma. Now, they can make them available to you in Broken Bow or Boise City or Miami or Hollis, but as long as it's inside the state, they have to make those records available to you there. Okay. When the project's over, make sure that your agreement provides that it can be decommissioned. Oklahoma now has a law, it's part of the Wind Energy Development Act, that says developers have to decommission their projects when the project's over. That means disassembling the equipment, getting the equipment out, restoring the soils, restoring the vegetation. Try to make it as close as possible to what it looked like before we came in there. Again, that's a requirement by law. They also, if they've built their project since the enactment, also have to, in 10 years, I believe, 15 years, they have to post a bond to make sure that they can do that. In other words, that they just don't skip town and leave it there. Oh, well, we've already actually talked about this. I'm sorry. Moving on. And apparently I thought it was so nice, I put it in there twice. Okay. There we go. Whoops, I went too fast. That is a sip of water from a fire hose when we're talking about wind energy leasing there. One thing I would tell you too, again, refer to the chapter in the handbook that talks about leasing, that talks about these issues in a little bit more detail. Also, visit the links that we have on that website, because among those links, you'll find some really good checklists. When you're looking over a wind energy development agreement, use those checklists as a guide to say, does my agreement deal with this? Does it agree with that? And make sure that you feel comfortable with it. I'm going to tell you something else, as well, and that is that agreements are not going to get better over time. In other words, if you signed a bad agreement, it's not going to get better. Contracts do not age like wine. Contracts age like milk. Okay? Just understand that. So make sure that you've got an agreement that you like and that you can live with when you sign it, because it's not going to get better. We've got just a little bit of time for questions, just about 5 minutes, and then we'll get on our tour. But does anybody have any questions real quick? Sir, yes, sir.
If I own land next to a wind tower or nothing, but I have signed the lease, can they hold me to the clause on building anything?
Oh, the question was, if you have not signed an agreement, but you're next to a wind energy project, can they hold you to the non-obstruction requirement? And the answer is no. That's not a requirement of general law, that's a contract requirement. So they can't tell you anything that you can do with your property. Anybody else? Yes?
Does a lot of the principles you give also apply to transmission lines agreements?
Do the principles that we've talked about today apply to transmission easements? Some of them do. And I will tell you that transmission easements definitely age like milk. When you're reading a transmission easement, pay very close attention to it, because sometimes the developers may ask for a larger easement than they actually need. So make sure that you understand the width of that easement. Also understand what that easement says you can and cannot do within the easement territory, because lots of times if we're talking about overhead lines, for example, you may not be able to build any improvements in that easement area. Are you comfortable with that? Sometimes the easement will ask for rights that they couldn't condemn. One issue that was a subject of a lot of controversy lately was that some people that had negotiated easements had also negotiated oil and gas rights underneath the easement, which meant that they had to be paid if there was a lease on the property. Now that Exploration Rights Act of 2011 fixed a lot of that, but just make sure you understand exactly what they can and cannot condemn, because when we're talking about transmission easements, if we're talking about a public utility can condemn an easement, but if it's just a private developer, they don't have that power. They have to negotiate that through an agreement with the landowner. That's the topic of another hour-and-a-half seminar that we'll have to come back down here and present sometime. And I'm actually working on that one right now. As a matter of fact, I'm going to present it at the National Ag Law meetings along with Rusty. So that's a very good question. The answer is we're working on that one. Yes?
Can the power lines and oil pipelines cross? They go under or over the other one, like if they meet crossways.
Oh, are you talking? Your question was about the intersection of electrical lines and pipelines. Are you talking about the underground electrical lines?
Yeah.
Generally, they would not want underground electrical lines and oil pipelines to be crossed, unless one of them was buried significantly below the other one, and even then they probably wouldn't want that to happen, because it would make the maintenance of one a challenge for the other. So it is a very real concern, and the odds are they probably wouldn't let them cross. They might let them run parallel, though. They might let them run along the same space as long as they weren't over one another, because when they go over one another, that's when you create a lot of the risks in maintaining either one.
But there is a pipeline across the farm that I have a lease on, but they can't go around it, because it
Goes to the entire property.
But they have to put the wind thing either on one side or the other.
And my guess is, and I'm not a developer, but I'm trying to think like one. I would say what they would probably do is probably look at trying to take a line parallel to that pipeline, or for a limited distance, they might use an overhead line to get around that issue. So I don't think it would be a problem that they couldn't solve, but it would be a little bit trickier. Yes?
Would you mind repeating the website that you keep referring to?
Oh, yes. All right. Pencils ready? The website where we've collected all of the other websites that talk about wind energy is at AgEcon, that's AGECON, dot OkState, that's OKSTATE, dot edu, which is spelled edu, /wind. And at that website, if you go to the links, actually, Brad, would you mind switching us to internet, and I'll just show them that website? You can just close this presentation and go to Internet Explorer. And maybe in the history, because I think we just visited it. There we go. Oh, one too many ends. Sorry, I'm not being critical of your typographic skills. Oh, there it is right there. Just click on that one. There we go. And if you go to links, those are all of those links that we've compiled there for you. So if you want to learn anything more, because we can't talk about everything in as much detail as we would like, obviously, click on any of those and you can find out. And by the way, we tried to find only government or university-sponsored links there. There are some private industry links, but we recognize that when you're talking about private industry information, they may have a vested interest in that. So we tried to pick as much objective research-based information as we could for you. If you go back up to the page, later on, you'll be able to download copies of the presentations that you saw today, and we'll also have the videos of the presentations you saw today. So if you just didn't get enough of this, you can download it at your leisure and watch it when you want. Also, when we get our handbooks finished up, we're going to have the finished version of the handbooks available for download on the website, so you can get those when you want to as well. Yes, ma'am?
Do you have something like this on transmission lines?
The question is, do we have a presentation like this on transmission lines? We kind of do. One of our videos is a very short presentation about transmission lines, and we're actually working on developing those materials right now. Matter of fact, later this month, Rusty and I are going to go to the American Agricultural Law meetings, and one of the presentations I'm giving is a new presentation on transmission lines. So,
How can we see that?
coming soon. We'll post it up here as well. We'll have that up here.
Go to the links?
Yeah, go to the presentations and videos, and it'll be there. I got time probably for one more. Yes, ma'am.
University is Miss Bell.
Yeah, well, you know,
Well, if you try to put it in the computer.
I had a grad student do that, so, you know,
What if
give him a break.
you don't have internet? How can we get the hard copy?
Excellent question. Call Brad. Yep. Call your extension agent, or you can call me, and my contact information is in one of your presentations there. Contact me, and we'll be happy to get you a hard copy.